Don't forget to subscribe. Afterwards, the wisest and most spiritual books from the greatest authors await you every day. And now buckle up, sit back and we'll begin. Carlos Castaneda. Book 3. The Journey to Ixtlan. The Last Battle on Earth. Monday, July 24, 1961. Around mid-afternoon, after we had roamed for hours in the desert, Don Juan chose a place to rest in a shaded area. As soon as we sat down, he began talking. He said that I had learned a great deal about hunting, but I had not changed as much as he had wished. It's not enough to know how to make and set up traps, he said. A hunter must live as a hunter in order to draw the most out of his life. Unfortunately, changes are difficult and happen very slowly. Sometimes it takes years for a man to become convinced of the need to change. It took me years, but maybe I didn't have a knack for hunting. I think for me the most difficult thing was to really want to change. I assured him that I understood his point. In fact, since he had begun to teach me how to hunt, I also had begun to reassess my actions. Perhaps the most dramatic discovery for me was that I liked Don Juan's ways. I liked Don Juan as a person. There was something solid about his behavior. The way he conducted himself left no doubts about his mastery, and yet he had never exercised his advantage to demand anything from me. His interest in changing my way of life, I felt, was akin to an impersonal suggestion, or perhaps it was akin to an authoritative commentary on my failures. He had made me very aware of my failings, yet I could not see how his ways would remedy anything in me. I sincerely believed that, in light of what I wanted to do in my life, his ways would have only brought me misery and hardship, hence the impasse. However, I had learned to respect his mastery, which had always been expressed in terms of beauty and precision. I have decided to shift my tactics, he said. I asked him to explain. His statement was vague, and I was not sure whether or not he was referring to me. A good hunter changes his ways as often as he needs, he replied. You know that yourself. What do you have in mind, Don Juan? A hunter must not only know about the habits of his prey, he also must know that there are powers on this earth that guide men and animals and everything that is living. He stopped talking. I waited, but he seemed to have come to the end of what he wanted to say. What kind of powers are you talking about? I asked after a long pause. Powers that guide our lives and our deaths. Don Juan stopped talking and seemed to be having tremendous difficulty in deciding what to say. He rubbed his hands and shook his head, puffing out his jaws. Twice he signaled me to be quiet as I started to ask him to explain his cryptic statements. You won't be able to stop yourself easily, he finally said. I know that you're stubborn, but that doesn't matter. The more stubborn you are, the better it'll be when you finally succeed in changing yourself. I am trying my best, I said. No. I disagree. You're not trying your best. You just said that because it sounds good to you. In fact, you've been saying the same thing about everything you do. You've been trying your best for years to no avail. Something must be done to remedy that. I felt compelled, as usual, to defend myself. Don Juan seemed to aim, as a rule, at my very weakest points. I remembered then that every time I had attempted to defend myself against his criticisms, I had ended up feeling like a fool, and I stopped myself in the midst of a long explanatory speech. Don Juan examined me with curiosity and laughed. He said in a very kind tone that he had already told me that all of us were fools. I was not an exception. You always feel compelled to explain your acts, as if you were the only man on earth who's wrong, he said. It's your old feeling of importance. You have too much of it. You also have too much personal history. On the other hand, you don't assume responsibility for your acts. You're not using your death as an advisor, and above all, you are too accessible. In other words, your life is as messy as it was before I met you. Again, I had a genuine surge of pride and wanted to argue that he was wrong. He gestured me to be quiet. One must assume responsibility for being in a weird world, he said. We are in a weird world, you know. I nodded my head affirmatively. We're not talking about the same thing, he said. For you, the world is weird because if you're not bored with it, you're at odds with it. For me, the world is weird because it is stupendous, awesome, mysterious, unfathomable. My interest has been to convince you that you must assume responsibility for being here, in this marvelous world, in this marvelous desert, in this marvelous time. I wanted to convince you that you must learn to make every act count, since you are going to be here for only a short while, in fact, too short for witnessing all the marvels of it. I insisted that to be bored with the world or to be at odds with it was the human condition. So, change it, he replied dryly. If you do not respond to that challenge, you are as good as dead. He dared me to name an issue, an item in my life that had engaged all my thoughts. I said art. I had always wanted to be an artist, and for years I had tried my hand at that. I still had the painful memory of my failure. You have never taken the responsibility for being in this unfathomable world, he said in an indicting tone. Therefore, you were never an artist, and perhaps you'll never be a hunter. This is my best, Don Juan. No. You don't know what your best is. I am doing all I can. You're wrong again. You can do better. There is one simple thing wrong with you. You think you have plenty of time. He paused and looked at me as if waiting for my reaction. You think you have plenty of time, he repeated. Plenty of time for what, Don Juan? You think your life is going to last forever. No. I don't. Then, if you don't think your life is going to last forever, what are you waiting for? Why the hesitation to change? Has it ever occurred to you, Don Juan, that I may not want to change? Yes, it has occurred to me. I did not want to change either, just like you. However, I didn't like my life. I was tired of it, just like you. Now I don't have enough of it. I vehemently asserted that his insistence about changing my way of life was frightening and arbitrary. I said that I really agreed with him, at a certain level, but the mere fact that he was always the master that called the shots made the situation untenable for me. You don't have time for this display, you fool, he said in a severe tone. This, whatever you're doing now, may be your last act on Earth. It may very well be your last battle. There is no power which could guarantee that you are going to live one more minute. I know that, I said with contained anger. No. You don't. If you knew that, you would be a hunter. I contended that I was aware of my impending death, but it was useless to talk or think about it, since I could not do anything to avoid it. Don Juan laughed and said I was like a comedian going mechanically through a routine. If this were your last battle on Earth, I would say that you are an idiot, he said calmly. You are wasting your last act on Earth in some stupid mood. We were quiet for a moment. My thoughts ran rampant. He was right, of course. You have no time, my friend, no time. None of us have time, he said. I agree, Don Juan, but don't just agree with me, he snapped. You must, instead of agreeing so easily, act upon it. Take the challenge. Change. Just like that? That's right. The change I'm talking about never takes place by degrees, it happens suddenly. And you are not preparing yourself for that sudden act that will bring a total change. I believed he was expressing a contradiction. I explained to him that if I were preparing myself to change, I was certainly changing by degrees. You haven't changed at all, he said. That is why you believe you're changing little by little. Yet, perhaps you will surprise yourself someday by changing suddenly and without a single warning. I know this is so, and thus I don't lose sight of my interest in convincing you. I could not persist in my arguing. I was not sure of what I really wanted to say. After a moment's pause, Don Juan went on explaining his point. Perhaps I should put it in a different way, he said. What I recommend you to do is to notice that we do not have any assurance that our lives will go on indefinitely. I have just said that change comes suddenly and unexpectedly, and so does death. What do you think we can do about it? I thought he was asking a rhetorical question, but he made a gesture with his eyebrows urging me to answer. To live as happily as possible, I said. Right. But do you know anyone who lives happily? My first impulse was to say yes. I thought I could use a number of people I knew as examples. On second thought, however, I knew my effort would only be an empty attempt at exonerating myself. No, I said. I really don't. I do, Don Juan said. There are some people who are very careful about the nature of their acts. Their happiness is to act with the full knowledge that they don't have time, therefore, their acts have a peculiar power, their acts have a sense of. Don Juan seemed to be at a loss for words. He scratched his temples and smiled. Then suddenly he stood up as if he were through with our conversation. I beseeched him to finish what he was telling me. He sat down and puckered up his lips. Acts have power, he said. Especially when the person acting knows that those acts are his last battle. There is a strange consuming happiness in acting with the full knowledge that whatever one is doing may very well be one's last act on earth. I recommend that you reconsider your life and bring your acts into that light. I disagreed with him. Happiness for me was to assume that there was an inherent continuity to my acts, and that I would be able to continue doing, at will, whatever I was doing at the moment, especially if I was enjoying it. I told him that my disagreement was not a banal one, but stemmed from the conviction that the world and myself had a determinable continuity. Don Juan seemed to be amused by my efforts to make sense. He laughed, shook his head, scratched his hair, and finally, when I talked about a determinable continuity, threw his hat to the ground and stomped on it. I ended up laughing at his clowning. You don't have time, my friend, he said. That is the misfortune of human beings. None of us have sufficient time, and your continuity has no meaning in this awesome, mysterious world. Your continuity only makes you timid, he said. Your acts cannot possibly have the flair, the power, the compelling force of the acts performed by a man who knows that he is fighting his last battle on earth. In other words, your continuity does not make you happy or powerful. I admitted that I was afraid of thinking I was going to die, and I accused him of causing great apprehension in me with his constant talk and concern about death. "But we are all going to die," he said. He pointed towards some hills in the distance. "There is something out there waiting for me, for sure, and I will join it, also for sure. But perhaps you're different, and death is not waiting for you at all." He laughed at my gesture of despair. "I don't want to think about it, Don Juan." "Why not?" "It is meaningless. If it is out there waiting for me, why should I worry about it?" "I didn't say that you have to worry about it." "What am I supposed to do then?" "Use it. Focus your attention on the link between you and your death, without remorse or sadness or worrying. Focus your attention on the fact you don't have time and let your acts flow accordingly. Let each of your acts be your last battle on earth. Only under those conditions will your acts have their rightful power. Otherwise they will be, for as long as you live, the acts of a timid man." "Is it so terrible to be a timid man?" "No. It isn't if you are going to be immortal, but if you are going to die, there is no time for timidity, simply because timidity makes you cling to something that exists only in your thoughts. It soothes you while everything is at a lull, but then the awesome, mysterious world will open its mouth for you, as it will open for every one of us, and then you will realize that your sure ways were not sure at all. Being timid prevents us from examining and exploiting our lot as men. It is not natural to live with the constant idea of our death, Don Juan. Our death is waiting, and this very act we're performing now may well be our last battle on earth," he replied in a solemn voice. "I call it a battle because it is a struggle. Most people move from act to act without any struggle or thought. The hunter, on the contrary, assesses every act, and since he has an intimate knowledge of his death, he proceeds judiciously, as if every act were his last battle. Only a fool would fail to notice the advantage a hunter has over his fellow men. A hunter gives his last battle its due respect. It's only natural that his last act on earth should be the best of himself. It's pleasurable that way. It dulls the edge of his fright." "You are right," I conceded. "It's just hard to accept. It'll take years for you to convince yourself, and then it'll take years for you to act accordingly. I only hope you have time left." "I get scared when you say that," I said. Don Juan examined me with a serious expression on his face. "I've told you, this is a weird world," he said. "The forces that guide men are unpredictable, awesome, yet their splendor is something to witness." He stopped talking and looked at me again. He seemed to be on the verge of revealing something to me, but he checked himself and smiled. "Is there something that guides us?" I asked. "Certainly. There are powers that guide us." "Can you describe them?" "Not really, except to call them forces, spirits, airs, winds, or anything like that." I wanted to probe him further, but before I could ask anything else he stood up. I stared at him, flabbergasted. He had stood up in one single movement. His body simply jerked up and he was on his feet. I was still pondering upon the unusual skill that would be needed in order to move with such speed when he told me in a dry tone of command to stalk a rabbit, catch it, kill it, skin it, and roast the meat before the twilight. He looked up at the sky and said that I might have enough time. I automatically started off, proceeding the way I had done scores of times. Don Juan walked beside me and followed my movements with a scrutinizing look. I was very calm and moved carefully, and I had no trouble at all in catching a male rabbit. "Now kill it," Don Juan said dryly. I reached into the trap to grab hold of the rabbit. I had it by the ears and was pulling it out when a sudden sensation of terror invaded me. For the first time since Don Juan had begun to teach me to hunt, it occurred to me that he had never taught me how to kill game. In the scores of times we had roamed in the desert, he himself had only killed one rabbit, 2 quail and 1 rattlesnake. I dropped the rabbit and looked at Don Juan. "I can't kill it," I said. "Why not?" "I've never done that." "But you've killed hundreds of birds and other animals." "With a gun, not with my bare hands." "What difference does it make? This rabbit's time is up." Don Juan's tone shocked me. It was so authoritative, so knowledgeable. It left no doubts in my mind that he knew that the rabbit's time was up. "Kill it," he commanded with a ferocious look in his eyes. "I can't." He yelled at me that the rabbit had to die. He said that its roaming in that beautiful desert had come to an end. I had no business stalling, because the power of the spirit that guides rabbits had led that particular one into my trap, right at the edge of the twilight. A series of confusing thoughts and feelings overtook me, as if the feelings had been out there waiting for me. I felt with agonizing clarity the rabbit's tragedy, to have fallen into my trap. In a matter of seconds my mind swept across the most crucial moments of my own life, the many times I had been the rabbit myself. I looked at it, and it looked at me. The rabbit had backed up against the side of the cage. It was almost curled up, very quiet and motionless. We exchanged a somber glance, and that glance, which I fancied to be of silent despair, cemented a complete identification on my part. "The hell with it," I said loudly. "I won't kill anything. That rabbit goes free." A profound emotion made me shiver. My arms trembled as I tried to grab the rabbit by the ears. It moved fast and I missed. I again tried and fumbled once more. I became desperate. I had the sensation of nausea and quickly kicked the trap in order to smash it and let the rabbit go free. The cage was unsuspectedly strong and did not break as I thought it would. My despair mounted to an unbearable feeling of anguish. Using all my strength, I stomped on the edge of the cage with my right foot. The sticks cracked loudly. I pulled the rabbit out. I had a moment of relief, which was shattered to bits in the next instant. The rabbit hung limp in my hand. It was dead. I did not know what to do. I became preoccupied with finding out how it had died. I turned to Don Juan. He was staring at me. A feeling of terror sent a chill through my body. Juan sat down by some rocks. I had a terrible headache. Don Juan put his hand on my head and whispered in my ear that I had to skin the rabbit and roast it before the twilight was over. I felt nauseated. He very patiently talked to me as if he were talking to a child. He said that the powers that guided men or animals had led that particular rabbit to me, in the same way they will lead me to my own death. He said the rabbit's death had been a gift for me in exactly the same way my own death will be a gift for something or someone else. I was dizzy. The simple events of that day had crushed me. I tried to think that it was only a rabbit. I could not, however, shake off the uncanny identification I had had with it. Don Juan said that I needed to eat some of its meat, if only morsel, in order to validate my finding. "I can't do that," I protested meekly. "We are dregs in the hands of those forces," he snapped at me. "So stop your self-importance and use this gift properly." I picked up the rabbit, It was warm. Don Juan leaned over and whispered in my ear, "Your trap was his last battle on Earth. I told you, he had no more time to roam in this marvelous desert." Becoming accessible to power. Thursday, August 11, 1961. As soon as I got out of my car, I complained to Don Juan that I was not feeling well. Sit down," he said softly and almost led me by the hand to his porch. He smiled and patted me on the back. 2 weeks before, on August 4th, Don Juan, as he had said, changed his tactics with me and allowed me to ingest some payat buttons. During the height of my hallucinatory experience, I played with a dog that lived in the house where the payat session took place. Don Juan interpreted my interaction with the dog as a very special event. He contended that at moments of power, such as the one I had been living then, the world of ordinary affairs did not exist, and nothing could be taken for granted, that the dog was not really a dog, but the incarnation of Mescalito, the power or deity contained in payat. The post-effects of that experience were a general sense of fatigue and melancholy, plus the incidence of exceptionally vivid dreams and nightmares. "Where's your writing gear?" Don Juan asked as I sat down on the porch. I had left my notebooks in my car. Don Juan walked back to the car and carefully pulled out my briefcase and brought it to my side. He asked if I usually carried my briefcase when I walked. I said I did. "That's madness," he said. "I've told you never to carry anything in your hands when you walk. Get a knapsack." I laughed. The idea of carrying my notes in a knapsack was ludicrous. I told him that ordinarily I wore a suit, and a knapsack over a three-piece suit would be a preposterous sight. "Put your coat on over the knapsack," he said. "It is better that people think you're a hunchback than to ruin your body carrying all this around." He urged me to get out my notebook and write. He seemed to be making a deliberate effort to put me at ease. I complained again about the feeling of physical discomfort and the strange sense of unhappiness I was experiencing. Don Juan laughed and said, "You're beginning to learn." We then had a long conversation. He said that Mescalito, by allowing me to play with him, had pointed me out as a chosen man, and that, although he was baffled by the omen because I was not an Indian, he was going to pass on to me some secret knowledge. He said that he had had a benefactor himself, who taught him how to become a man of knowledge. I sensed that something dreadful was about to happen. The revelation that I was his chosen man, plus the unquestionable strangeness of his ways and the devastating effect that payat had had on me, created a state of unbearable apprehension and indecision. But Don Juan disregarded my feelings and recommended that I should only think of the wonder of Mescalito playing with me. "Think about nothing else," he said. "The rest will come to you of itself." He stood up and patted me gently on the head and said in a very soft voice, "I am going to teach you how to become a warrior in the same manner I have taught you how to hunt. I must warn you, though, learning how to hunt has not made you into a hunter, nor would learning how to become a warrior make you one." I experienced a sense of frustration, a physical discomfort that bordered on anguish. I complained about the vivid dreams and nightmares I was having. He seemed to deliberate for a moment and sat down again. "They're weird dreams," I said. "You've always had weird dreams," he retorted. "I'm telling you, this time they are truly more weird than anything I've ever had. Don't concern yourself. They are only dreams. Like the dreams of any ordinary dreamer, They don't have power. So what's the use of worrying about them or talking about them? They bother me, Don Juan. Isn't there something I can do to stop them? Nothing? Let them pass, he said. Now it's time for you to become accessible to power, and you are going to begin by tackling dreaming. The tone of voice he used when he said dreaming made me think that he was using the word in a very particular fashion. I was pondering about a proper question to ask when he began to talk again. I've never told you about dreaming, because until now I was only concerned with teaching you how to be a hunter, he said. A hunter is not concerned with the manipulation of power, therefore his dreams are only dreams. They might be poignant, but they are not dreaming. A warrior, on the other hand, seeks power, and one of the avenues to power is dreaming. You may say that the difference between a hunter and a warrior is that a warrior is on his way to power, while a hunter knows nothing or very little about it. The decision as to who can be a warrior and who can only be a hunter is not up to us. That decision is in the realm of the powers that guide men. That's why your playing with Mescalito was such an important omen. Those forces guided you to me. They took you to that bus depot, remember? Some clown brought you to me. A perfect omen, a clown pointing you out. So, I taught you how to be a hunter. And then the other perfect omen, Mescalito himself playing with you. See what I mean? His weird logic was overwhelming. His words created visions of myself succumbing to something awesome and unknown, something which I had not bargained for, and which I had not conceived existed, even in my wildest fantasies. What do you propose I should do? I asked. Become accessible to power, tackle your dreams, he replied. You call them dreams because you have no power. A warrior, being a man who seeks power, doesn't call them dreams, he calls them real. You mean he takes his dreams as being reality? He doesn't take anything as being anything else. What you call dreams are real for a warrior. You must understand that a warrior is not a fool. A warrior is an immaculate hunter who hunts power. He's not drunk or crazed, and he has neither the time nor the disposition to bluff, or to lie to himself, or to make a wrong move. The stakes are too high for that. The stakes are his trimmed orderly life which he has taken so long to tighten and perfect. He is not going to throw that away by making some stupid miscalculation, by taking something for being something else. Dreaming is real for a warrior because in it he can act deliberately, he can choose and reject, he can select from a variety of items those which lead to power, and then he can manipulate them and use them, while in an ordinary dream he cannot act deliberately. Do you mean then, Don Juan, that dreaming is real? Of course it is real. As real as what we are doing now? If you want to compare things, I can say that it is perhaps more real. In dreaming you have power, you can change things, you may find out countless concealed facts, you can control whatever you want. Don Juan's premises always had appealed to me at a certain level. I could easily understand his liking the idea that one could do anything in dreams, but I could not take him seriously. The jump was too great. We looked at each other for a moment. His statements were insane, and yet he was, to the best of my knowledge, one of the most level-headed men I had ever met. I told him that I could not believe he took his dreams to be reality. He chuckled as if he knew the magnitude of my untenable position, then he stood up without saying a word and walked inside his house. I sat for a long time in a state of stupor until he called me to the back of his house. He had made some corn gruel and handed me a bowl. I asked him about the time when one was awake. I wanted to know if he called it anything in particular. But he did not understand or did not want to answer. "What do you call this, what we're doing now?" I asked, meaning that what we were doing was reality as opposed to dreams. "I call it eating," he said and contained his laughter. "I call it reality," I said. "Because our eating is actually taking place. Dreaming also takes place," he replied, giggling. "And so does hunting, walking, laughing." I did not persist in arguing. I could not, however, even if I stretched myself beyond my limits, accept his premise. He seemed to be delighted with my despair. As soon as we had finished eating, he casually stated that we were going to go for a hike, but we were not going to roam in the desert in the manner we had done before. "It's different this time," he said. "From now on we're going to places of power. You're going to learn how to make yourself accessible to power." I again expressed my turmoil. I said I was not qualified for that endeavor. "Come on, you're indulging in silly fears," he said in a low voice, patting me on the back and smiling benevolently. "I've been catering to your hunter's spirit. You like to roam with me in this beautiful desert. It's too late for you to quit." He began to walk into the desert chaparral. He signaled me with his head to follow him. I could have walked to my car and left, except that I liked to roam in that beautiful desert with him. I liked the sensation, which I experienced only in his company, that this was indeed an awesome, mysterious yet beautiful world. As he said, I was hooked. Don Juan led me to the hills towards the east. It was a long hike. It was a hot day. The heat, however, which ordinarily would have been unbearable to me, was somehow unnoticeable. We walked for quite a distance into a canyon until Don Juan came to a halt and sat down in the shade of some boulders. I took some crackers out of my knapsack, but he told me not to bother with them. He said that I should sit in a prominent place. He pointed to a single almost round boulder 10 or 15 feet away and helped me climb to the top. I thought he was also going to sit there, but instead he just climbed part of the way in order to hand me some pieces of dry meat. He told me with a deadly serious expression that it was power meat and should be chewed very slowly and should not be mixed with any other food. He then walked back to the shaded area and sat down with his back against a rock. He seemed relaxed, almost sleepy. He remained in the same position until I had finished eating. Then he sat up straight and tilted his head to the right. He seemed to be listening attentively. He glanced at me 2 or 3 times, stood up abruptly, and began to scan the surroundings with his eyes, the way a hunter would do. I automatically froze on the spot and only moved my eyes in order to follow his movements. Very carefully he stepped behind some rocks, as if he were expecting game to come into the area where we were. I realized then that we were in a round cove-like bend in the dry water canyon, surrounded by sandstone boulders. Don Juan suddenly came out from behind the rocks and smiled at me. He stretched his arms, yawned, and walked towards the boulder where I was. I relaxed my tense position and sat down. "What happened?" I asked in a whisper. He answered me, yelling, that there was nothing around there to worry about. I felt an immediate jolt in my stomach. His answer was inappropriate, and it was inconceivable to me that he would yell unless he had a specific reason for it. I began to slide down from the boulder, but he yelled that I should stay there a while longer. "What are you doing?" I asked. He sat down and concealed himself between two rocks at the base of the boulder where I was, and then he said in a very loud voice that he had only been looking around because he thought he had heard something. I asked if he had hurt a large animal. He put his hand to his ear and yelled that he was unable to hear me and that I should shout my words. I felt ill at ease yelling, but he urged me in a loud voice to speak up. I shouted that I wanted to know what was going on, and he shouted back that there was really nothing around there. He yelled, asking if I could see anything unusual from the top of the boulder. I said no, and he asked me to describe to him the terrain towards the south. We shouted back and forth for a while, and then he signaled me to come down. I joined him and he whispered in my ear that the yelling was necessary to make our presence known, because I had to make myself accessible to the power of that specific water hole. I looked around but could not see the water hole. He pointed that we were standing on it. "There's water here," he said in a whisper, "and also power. There's a spirit here and we have to lure it out. Perhaps it will come after you." I wanted to know more about the alleged spirit, but he insisted on total silence. He advised me to stay perfectly still and not let out a whisper or make the slightest movement to betray our presence. Apparently it was easy for him to remain in complete immobility for hours. For me, however, it was sheer torture. My legs fell asleep, my back ached, and tension built up around my neck and shoulders. My entire body became numb and cold. I was in great discomfort when Don Juan finally stood up. He just sprung to his feet and extended his hand to me to help me stand up. As I was trying to stretch my legs, I realized the inconceivable easiness with which Don Juan had jumped up after hours of immobility. It took quite some time for my muscles to regain the elasticity needed for walking. Don Juan headed back for the house. He walked extremely slowly. He set up a length of 3 paces as the distance I should observe and following him. He meandered around the regular route and crossed it 4 or 5 times in different directions. When we finally arrived at his house, it was late afternoon. I tried to question him about the events of the day. He explained that talking was unnecessary. For the time being, I had to refrain from asking questions until we were in a place of power. I was dying to know what he meant by that and tried to whisper a question, but he reminded me, with a cold, severe look, that he meant business. We sat on his porch for hours. I worked on my notes. From time to time he handed me a piece of dry meat. Finally it was too dark to write. I tried to think about the new developments, but some part of myself refused to, and I fell asleep. Saturday, August 19, 1961. Yesterday morning Don Juan and I drove to town and ate breakfast at a restaurant. He advised me not to change my eating habits too drastically. "Your body is not used to power meat," he said. "You'd get sick if you didn't eat your food." He himself ate heartily. When I joked about it, he simply said, "My body likes everything." Around noon we hiked back to the water canyon. We proceeded to make ourselves noticeable to the spirit by noisy talk and by a forced silence which lasted hours. When we left the place, instead of heading back to the house, Don Juan took off in the direction of the mountains. We reached some mild slopes first, and then we climbed to the top of some high hills. There, Don Juan picked out a spot to rest in the open, unshaded area. He told me that we had to wait until dusk and that I should conduct myself in the most natural fashion, which included asking all the questions I wanted. "I know that the spirit is out there lurking," he said in a very low voice. "Where?" "Out there, in the bushes." "What kind of spirit is it?" He looked at me with a quizzical expression and retorted, "How many kinds are there?" We both laughed. I was asking questions out of nervousness. "It'll come out at dusk," he said. "We just have to wait." I remained quiet. I had run out of questions. "This is the time when we must keep on talking," he said. "The human voice attracts spirits. There's one lurking out there now. We are making ourselves available to it, so keep on talking." I experienced an idiotic sense of vacuity. I could not think of anything to say. He laughed and patted me on the back. "You're truly a pill," he said. "When you have to talk, you lose your tongue. Come on, beat your gums." He made a hilarious gesture of beating his gums together, opening and closing his mouth with great speed. "There are certain things we will talk about from now on only at places of power," he went on. "I have brought you here because this is your first trial. This is a place of power, and here we can talk only about power." "I really don't know what power is," I said. "Power is something a warrior deals with," he said. "At first it's an incredible, far-fetched affair. It is hard to even think about it. This is what's happening to you now. Then power becomes a serious matter. One may not have it, or one may not even fully realize that it exists, yet one knows that something is there, something which was not noticeable before. Next, power is manifested as something uncontrollable that comes to oneself. It is not possible for me to say how it comes or what it really is. It is nothing, and yet it makes marvels appear before your very eyes. And finally, power is something in oneself, something that controls one's acts and yet obeys one's command." There was a short pause. Don Juan asked me if I had understood. I felt ludicrous saying I did. He seemed to have noticed my dismay and chuckled. "I am going to teach you right here the first step to power," he said as if he were dictating a letter to me. "I am going to teach you how to set up dreaming." He looked at me and again asked me if I knew what he meant. I did not. I was hardly following him at all. He explained that to set up dreaming meant to have a concise and pragmatic control over the general situation of a dream, comparable to the control one has over any choice in the desert, such as climbing up a hill or remaining in the shade of a water canyon. "You must start by doing something very simple," he said. "Tonight in your dreams you must look at your hands." I laughed out loud. His tone was so factual that it was as if he were telling me to do something commonplace. "Why do you laugh?" he asked with surprise. "How can I look at my hands in my dreams?" "Very simple, focus your eyes on them just like this." He bent his head forward and stared at his hands with his mouth open. His gesture was so comical that I had to laugh. "Seriously, how can you expect me to do that?" I asked. "The way I've told you," he snapped. "You can, of course, look at whatever you goddamn please, your toes, or your belly, or your pecker, for that matter. I said your hands because that was the easiest thing for me to look at. Don't think it's a joke. Dreaming is as serious as seeing or dying or any other thing in this awesome, mysterious world. Think about it as something entertaining. Imagine all the inconceivable things you could accomplish. A man hunting for power has almost no limits in his dreaming. I asked him to give me some pointers. There aren't any pointers, he said. Just look at your hands. There must be more that you could tell me, I insisted. He shook his head and squinted his eyes, staring at me in short glances. Every one of us is different, he finally said. What you call pointers would only be what I myself did when I was learning. We are not the same, we aren't even vaguely alike. Maybe anything you'd say would help me. It would be simpler for you just to start looking at your hands. He seemed to be organizing his thoughts and bobbed his head up and down. Every time you look at anything in your dreams it changes shape, he said after a long silence. The trick in learning to set up dreaming is obviously not just to look at things, but to sustain the sight of them. Dreaming is real when one has succeeded in bringing everything into focus. Then there is no difference between what you do when you sleep and what you do when you are not sleeping. Do you see what I mean? I confessed that although I understood what he had said, I was incapable of accepting his premise. I brought up the point that in a civilized world there were scores of people who had delusions and could not distinguish what took place in the real world from what took place in their fantasies. I said that such persons were undoubtedly mentally ill, and my uneasiness increased every time he would recommend I should act like a crazy man. After my long explanation, Don Juan made a comical gesture of despair by putting his hands to his cheeks and sighing loudly. "Leave your civilized world alone," he said. "Let it be. Nobody is asking you to behave like a madman. I've already told you, a warrior has to be perfect in order to deal with the powers he hunts. How can you conceive that a warrior would not be able to tell things apart? On the other hand, you, my friend, who know what the real world is, would fumble and die in no time at all if you would have to depend on your ability for telling what is real and what is not." I obviously had not expressed what I really had in mind. Every time I protested, I was simply voicing the unbearable frustration of being in an untenable position. "I am not trying to make you into a sick, crazy man," Don Juan went on. "You can do that yourself without my help. But the forces that guide us brought you to me, and I have been endeavoring to teach you to change your stupid ways and live the strong, clean life of a hunter. Then the forces guided you again and told me that you should learn to live the impeccable life of a warrior. Apparently you can't. But who can tell? We are as mysterious and as awesome as this unfathomable world, so who can tell what you're capable of?" There was an underlying tone of sadness in Don Juan's voice. I wanted to apologize, but he began to talk again. "You don't have to look at your hands," he said. "Like I've said, pick anything at all. But pick one thing in advance and find it in your dreams. I said your hands because they'll always be there. When they begin to change shape, you must move your sight away from them and pick something else, and then look at your hands again. It takes a long time to perfect this technique." I had become so involved in writing that I had not noticed that it was getting dark. The sun had already disappeared over the horizon. The sky was cloudy and the twilight was imminent. Don Juan stood up and gave furtive glances towards the south. "Let's go," he said. "We must walk south until the spirit of the water hole shows itself." We walked for perhaps half an hour. The terrain changed abruptly, and we came to a barren area. There was a large round hill where the chaparral had burned. It looked like a bald head. We walked towards it. I thought that Don Juan was going to climb the mild slope, but he stopped instead and remained in a very attentive position. His body seemed to have tensed as a single unit and shivered for an instant. Then he relaxed again and stood limply. I could not figure out how his body could remain erect while his muscles were so relaxed. At that moment a very strong gust of wind jolted me. Don Juan's body turned in the direction of the wind, towards the west. He did not use his muscles to turn, or at least he did not use them the way I would use mine to turn. Don Juan's body seemed rather to have been pulled from the outside. It was as if someone else had arranged his body to face a new direction. I kept on staring at him. He looked at me from the corner of his eye. The expression on his face was one of determination, purpose. All of his being was attentive, and I stared at him in wonder. I had never been in any situation that called for such a strange concentration. Suddenly his body shivered as though he had been splashed by a sudden shower of cold water. He had another jolt, and then he started to walk as if nothing had happened. I followed him. We flanked the naked hills on the east side until we were at the middle part of it. He stopped there, turning to face the west. From where we stood, the top of the hill was not so round and smooth as it had seemed to be from the distance. There was a cave, or a hole, near the top. I looked at it fixedly because Don Juan was doing the same. Another strong gust of wind sent a chill up my spine. Don Juan turned towards the south and scanned the area with his eyes. "There," he said in a whisper and pointed to an object on the ground. I strained my eyes to see. There was something on the ground, perhaps 20 feet away. It was light brown, and as I looked at it, it shivered. I focused all my attention on it. The object was almost round and seemed to be curled. In fact, it looked like a curled-up dog. "What is it?" I whispered to Don Juan. "I don't know," he whispered back as he peered at the object. "What does it look like to you?" I told him that it seemed to be a dog. "Too large for a dog," he said matter-of-factly. I took a couple of steps towards it, but Don Juan stopped me gently. I stared at it again. It was definitely some animal that was either asleep or dead. I could almost see its head. Its ears protruded like the ears of a wolf. By then I was definitely sure that it was a curled-up animal. I thought that it could have been a brown calf. I whispered that to Don Juan. He answered that it was too compact to be a calf, besides its ears were pointed. The animal shivered again, and then I noticed that it was alive. I could actually see that it was breathing, yet it did not seem to breathe rhythmically. The breaths that it took were more like irregular shivers. I had a sudden realization at that moment. "It's an animal that is dying," I whispered to Don Juan. "You're right," he whispered back. "But what kind of an animal?" I could not make out its specific features. Don Juan took a couple of cautious steps towards it. I followed him. It was quite dark by then, and we had to take 2 more steps in order to keep the animal in view. "Watch out," Don Juan whispered in my ear. "If it is a dying animal, it may leap on us with its last strength." The animal, whatever it was, seemed to be on its last legs. Its breathing was irregular. Its body shook spasmodically, but it did not change its curled-up position. At a given moment, however, a tremendous spasm actually lifted the animal off the ground. I heard an inhuman shriek, and the animal stretched legs. Its claws were more than frightening. They were nauseating. The animal tumbled on its side after stretching its legs and then rolled on its back. I heard a formidable growl and Don Juan's voice shouting, "Run for your life." And that was exactly what I did. I scrambled towards the top of the hill with unbelievable speed and agility. When I was halfway to the top, I looked back and saw Don Juan standing in the same place. He signaled me to come down. I ran down the hill. "What happened?" I asked, completely out of breath. "I think the animal is dead," he said. We advanced cautiously towards the animal. It was sprawled on its back. As I came closer to it, I nearly yelled with fright. I realized that it was not quite dead yet. Its body was still trembling. Its legs, which were sticking up in the air, shook wildly. The animal was definitely in its last gasps. I walked in front of Don Juan. A new jolt moved the animal's body, and I could see its head. I turned to Don Juan, horrified. Judging by its body, the animal was obviously a mammal, yet it had a beak, like a bird. I stared at it in complete and absolute horror. My mind refused to believe it. I was dumbfounded. I could not even articulate a word. Never in my whole existence had I witnessed anything of that nature. Something inconceivable was there in front of my very eyes. I wanted Don Juan to explain that incredible animal, but I could only mumble to him. He was staring at me. I glanced at him and glanced at the animal, and then something in me arranged the world, and I knew at once what the animal was. I walked over to it and picked it up. It was a large branch of a bush. It had been burned, and possibly the wind had blown some burnt debris which got caught in the dry branch, and thus gave the appearance of a large bulging round animal. The color of the burnt debris made it look light brown in contrast with the green vegetation. I laughed at my idiocy and excitedly explained to Don Juan that the wind blowing through it had made it look like a live animal. I thought he would be pleased with the way I had resolved the mystery, but he turned around and began walking to the top of the hill. I followed him. He crawled inside the depression that looked like a cave. It was not a hole but a shallow dent in the sandstone. Don Juan took some small branches and used them to scoop up the dirt that had accumulated in the bottom of the depression. "We have to get rid of the ticks," he said. He signaled me to sit down and told me to make myself comfortable because we were going to spend the night there. I began to talk about the branch, but he hushed me up. "What you've done is no triumph," he said. "You've wasted a beautiful power, a power that blew life into that dry twig." He said that a real triumph would have been for me to let go and follow the power until the world had ceased to exist. He did not seem to be angry with me or disappointed with my performance. He repeatedly stated that this was only the beginning, that it took time to handle power. He patted me on the shoulder and joked that earlier that day I was the person who knew what was real and what was not. I felt embarrassed. I began to apologize for my tendency of always being so sure of my ways. "It doesn't matter," he said. "That branch was a real animal and it was alive at the moment the power touched it. Since what kept it alive was power, the trick was, like in dreaming, to sustain the sight of it. See what I mean?" I wanted to ask something else, but he hushed me up and said that I should remain completely silent, but awake all night, and that he alone was going to talk for a while. He said that the spirit, which knew his voice, might become subdued with the sound of it and leave us alone. He explained that the idea of making oneself accessible to power had serious overtones. Power was a devastating force that could easily lead to one's death and had to be treated with great care. Becoming available to power had to be done systematically, but always with great caution. It involved making one's presence obvious by a contained display of loud talk or any other type of noisy activity, and then it was mandatory to observe a prolonged and total silence. A controlled outburst and a controlled quietness were the mark of a warrior. He said that properly I should have sustained the sight of the live monster for a while longer. In a controlled fashion, without losing my mind or becoming deranged with excitation or fear, I should have striven to stop the world. He pointed out that after I had run up the hill for dear life, I was in a perfect state for stopping the world. Combined in that state were fear, awe, power and death. He said that such a state would be pretty hard to repeat. I whispered in his ear, "What do you mean by stopping the world?" He gave me a ferocious look before he answered that it was a technique practiced by those who were hunting for power, a technique by virtue of which the world as we know it was made to collapse. The mood of a warrior. I drove up to Don Juan's house on Thursday, August 31, 1961, and before I even had a chance to greet him, he stuck his head through the window of my car, smiled at me, and said, "We must drive quite a distance to a place of power, and it's almost noon." He opened the door of my car, sat down next to me in the front seat, and directed me to drive south for about 70 miles. We then turned east onto a dirt road and followed it until we had reached the slopes of the mountains. I parked my car off the road in a depression Don Juan picked because it was deep enough to hide the car from view. From there we went directly to the top of the low hills, crossing a vast flat desolate area. When it got dark, Don Juan selected a place to sleep. He demanded complete silence. The next day we ate frugally and continued our journey in an easterly direction. The vegetation was no longer desert shrubbery, but thick green mountain bushes and trees. Around mid-afternoon we climbed to the top of a gigantic bluff of conglomerate rock, which looked like a wall. Don Juan sat down and signaled me to sit down also. "This is a place of power," he said after a moment's pause. "This is the place where warriors were buried a long time ago." At that instant a crow flew right above us, cawing. Don Juan followed its flight with a fixed gaze. I examined the rock and was wondering how and where the warriors had been buried when he tapped me on the shoulder. "Not here, you fool," he said, smiling. "Down there." He pointed to the field right below us at the bottom of the bluff, towards the east. He explained that the field in question was surrounded by a natural corral of boulders. From where I was sitting I saw an area which was perhaps 100 yards in diameter, and which looked like a perfect circle. Thick bushes covered its surface, camouflaging the boulders. I would not have noticed its perfect roundness if Don Juan had not pointed it out to me. He said that there were scores of such places scattered in the old world of the Indians. They were not exactly places of power, like certain hills or land formations which were the abode of spirits, but rather places of enlightenment where one could be taught, where one could find solutions to dilemmas. "All you have to do is come here," he said. "Or spend the night on this rock in order to rearrange your feelings." Are we going to spend the night here? I thought so, but a little crow just told me not to do that. I tried to find out more about the crow, but he hushed me up with an impatient movement of his hand. "Look at that circle of boulders," he said. "Fix it in your memory and then someday a crow will lead you to another one of these places. The more perfect its roundness is, the greater its power. Are the warrior's bones still buried here?" Don Juan made a comical gesture of puzzlement and then smiled broadly. "This is not a cemetery," he said. "Nobody is buried here. I said warriors were once buried here. I meant they used to come here to bury themselves for a night, or for 2 days, or for whatever length of time they needed to. I did not mean dead people's bones are buried here. I'm not concerned with cemeteries. There is no power in them. There is power in the bones of a warrior, though, but they are never in cemeteries. And there is even more power in the bones of a man of knowledge, yet it would be practically impossible to find them." "Who is a man of knowledge, Don Juan?" "Any warrior could become a man of knowledge. As I told you, a warrior is an impeccable hunter that hunts power. If he succeeds in his hunting, he can be a man of knowledge." "What do you?" He stopped my question with a movement of his hand. He stood up, signaled me to follow, and began descending on the steep east side of the bluff. There was a definite trail in the almost perpendicular face, leading to the round area. We slowly worked our way down the perilous path, and when we reached the bottom floor, Don Juan, without stopping at all, led me through the thick chaparral to the middle of the circle. There he used some thick dry branches to sweep a clean spot for us to sit. The spot was also perfectly round. "I intended to bury you here all night," he said. "But I know now that it is not time yet. You don't have power. I'm going to bury you only for a short while." I became very nervous with the idea of being enclosed and asked how he was planning to bury me. He giggled like a child and began collecting dry branches. He did not let me help him and said I should sit down and wait. He threw the branches he was collecting inside the clean circle. Then he made me lie down with my head towards the east, put my jacket under my head, and made a cage around my body. He constructed it by sticking pieces of branches about 2.5 feet in length in the soft dirt. The branches, which ended in forks, served as supports for some long sticks that gave the cage a frame and the appearance of an open coffin. He closed the box-like cage by placing small branches and leaves over the long sticks, encasing me from the shoulders down. He let my head stick out with my jacket as a pillow. He then took a thick piece of dry wood and, using it as a digging stick, he loosened the dirt around me and covered the cage with it. The frame was so solid and the leaves were so well placed that no dirt came inside. I could move my legs freely and could actually slide in and out. Don Juan said that ordinarily a warrior would construct the cage and then slip into it and seal it from the inside. "How about the animals?" I asked. "Can they scratch the surface dirt and sneak into the cage and hurt the man?" "No, that's not a worry for a warrior. It's a worry for you because you have no power. A warrior, on the other hand, is guided by his unbending purpose and can fend off anything. No rat or snake or mountain lion could bother him." "What do they bury themselves for, Don Juan?" "For enlightenment and for power." I experienced an extremely pleasant feeling of peace and satisfaction. The world at that moment seemed at ease. The quietness was exquisite and at the same time unnerving. I was not accustomed to that kind of silence. I tried to talk, but he hushed me. After a while, the tranquility of the place affected my mood. I began to think of my life and my personal history, and experienced a familiar sensation of sadness and remorse. I told him that I did not deserve to be there, that his world was strong and fair and I was weak, and that my spirit had been distorted by the circumstances of my life. He laughed and threatened to cover my head with dirt if I kept on talking in that vein. He said that I was a man, and like any man I deserved everything that was a man's lot: joy, pain, sadness and struggle, and that the nature of one's acts was unimportant as long as one acted as a warrior. Lowering his voice to almost a whisper, he said that if I really felt that my spirit was distorted, I should simply fix it, purge it, make it perfect, because there was no other task in our entire lives which was more worthwhile. Not to fix the spirit was to seek death, and that was the same as to seek nothing, since death was going to overtake us regardless of anything. He paused for a long time, and then he said with a tone of profound conviction, "To seek the perfection of the warrior's spirit is the only task worthy of our manhood." His words acted as a catalyst. I felt the weight of my past actions as an unbearable and hindering load. I admitted that there was no hope for me. I began to weep, talking about my life. I said that I had been roaming for such a long time that I had become callous to pain and sadness, except on certain occasions when I would realize my aloneness and my helplessness. He did not say anything. He grabbed me by the armpits and pulled me out of the cage. I sat up when he let go of me. He also sat down. An uneasy silence set in between us. I thought he was giving me time to compose myself. I took my notebook and scribbled out of nervousness. "You feel like a leaf at the mercy of the wind, don't you?" he finally said, staring at me. That was exactly the way I felt. He seemed to empathize with me. He said that my mood reminded him of a song, and began to sing in a low tone. His singing voice was very pleasing, and the lyrics carried me away. "I'm so far away from the sky where I was born. Immense nostalgia invades my thoughts. Now that I am so alone and sad like a leaf in the wind, sometimes I want to weep, sometimes I want to laugh with longing. Que lejos estoy del cielo donde nacido. Inmensa nostalgia invade mi pensamiento. Ahora que estoy tan solo y triste que hoja al viento, quisiera llorar, quisiera reír de sentimiento." We did not speak for a long while. He finally broke the silence. "Since the day you were born, one way or another, someone has been doing something to you," he said. "That's correct," I said. "And they have been doing something to you against your will." "True. And by now you're helpless, like a leaf in the wind." "That's correct. That's the way it is." I said that the circumstances of my life had sometimes been devastating. He listened attentively, but I could not figure out whether he was just being agreeable or genuinely concerned, until I noticed that he was trying to hide a smile. "No matter how much you like to feel sorry for yourself, you have to change that," he said in a soft tone. "It doesn't jibe with the life of a warrior." He laughed and sang the song again, but contorted the intonation of certain words. The result was a ludicrous lament. He pointed out that the reason I had liked the song was because in my own life, I had done nothing else but find flaws with everything and lament. I could not argue with him. He was correct. Yet I believed I had sufficient reasons to justify my feeling of being like a leaf in the wind. "The hardest thing in the world is to assume the mood of a warrior," he said. "It is of no use to be sad and complain and feel justified in doing so, believing that someone is always doing something to us. Nobody is doing anything to anybody, much less to a warrior. You are here, with me, because you want to be here. You should have assumed full responsibility by now, so the idea that you are at the mercy of the wind would be inadmissible." He stood up and began to disassemble the cage. He scooped the dirt back to where he had gotten it from and carefully scattered all the sticks in the chaparral. Then he covered the clean circle with debris, leaving the area as if nothing had ever touched it. I commented on his proficiency. He said that a good hunter would know that we had been there no matter how careful he had been, because the tracks of men could not be completely erased. He sat cross-legged and told me to sit down as comfortably as possible, facing the spot where he had buried me, and stay put until my mood of sadness had dissipated. "A warrior buries himself in order to find power, not to weep with self-pity," he said. I attempted to explain, but he made me stop with an impatient movement of his head. He said that he had to pull me out of the cage in a hurry because my mood was intolerable, and he was afraid that the place would resent my softness and injure me. "Self-pity doesn't jibe with power," he said. "The mood of a warrior calls for control over himself, and at the same time it calls for abandoning himself." "How can that be?" I asked. "How can he control and abandon himself at the same time?" "It is a difficult technique," he said. He seemed to deliberate whether or not to continue talking. Twice he was on the verge of saying something, but he checked himself and smiled. "You're not over your sadness yet," he said. "You still feel weak, and there is no point in talking about the mood of a warrior now." Almost an hour went by in complete silence. Then he abruptly asked me if I had succeeded in learning the dreaming techniques he had taught me. I had been practicing assiduously and had been able, after a monumental effort, to obtain a degree of control over my dreams. Don Juan was very right in saying that one could interpret the exercises as being entertainment. For the first time in my life I had been looking forward to going to sleep. I gave him a detailed report of my progress. It had been relatively easy for me to learn to sustain the image of my hands after I had learned to command myself to look at them. My visions, although not always of my own hands, would last a seemingly long time until I would finally lose control and would become immersed in ordinary unpredictable dreams. I had no volition whatsoever over when I would give myself the command to look at my hands or to look at other items of the dreams. It would just happen. At a given moment I would remember that I had to look at my hands and then at the surroundings. There were nights, however, when I could not recall having done it at all. He seemed to be satisfied and wanted to know what were the usual items I had been finding in my visions. I could not think of anything in particular and started elaborating on a nightmarish dream I had had the night before. "Don't get so fancy," he said dryly. I told him that I had been recording all the details of my dreams. Since I had begun to practice looking at my hands, my dreams had become very compelling, and my sense of recall had increased to the point that I could remember minute details. He said that to follow them was a waste of time, because details and vividness were in no way important. Ordinary dreams get very vivid as soon as you begin to set up dreaming, he said. That vividness and clarity is a formidable barrier, and you are worse off than anyone I have ever met in my life. You have the worst mania. You write down everything you can. In all fairness, I believed what I was doing was appropriate. Keeping a meticulous record of my dreams was giving me a degree of clarity about the nature of the visions I had while sleeping. "Drop it," he said imperatively. "It's not helping anything. All you're doing is distracting yourself from the purpose of dreaming, which is control and power." He lay down and covered his eyes with his hat and talked without looking at me. "I'm going to remind you of all the techniques you must practice," he said. "First, you must focus your gaze on your hands as the starting point. Then shift your gaze to other items and look at them in brief glances. Focus your gaze on as many things as you can. Remember that if you only glance briefly, the images do not shift. Then go back to your hands. Every time you look at your hands, you renew the power needed for dreaming, so in the beginning don't look at too many things. 4 items will suffice every time. Later on, you may enlarge the scope until you can cover all you want. But as soon as the images begin to shift and you feel you are losing control, go back to your hands. When you feel you can gaze at things indefinitely, you will be ready for a new technique. I'm going to teach you this new technique now, but I expect you to put it to use only when you are ready." He was quiet for about 15 minutes. Finally, he sat up and looked at me. "The next step in setting up dreaming is to learn to travel," he said. "The same way you have learned to look at your hands, you can will yourself to move, to go places. First, you have to establish a place you want to go to. Pick a well-known spot, perhaps your school, or a park, or a friend's house, then will yourself to go there. This technique is very difficult. You must perform 2 tasks. You must will yourself to go to the specific locale, and then, when you have mastered that technique, you have to learn to control the exact time of your traveling." As I wrote down his statements, I had the feeling that I was really nuts. I was actually taking down insane instructions, knocking myself out in order to follow them. I experienced a surge of remorse and embarrassment. "What are you doing to me, Don Juan?" I asked, not really meaning it. He seemed surprised. He stared at me for an instant and then smiled. "You've been asking me the same question over and over. I'm not doing anything to you. You are making yourself accessible to power, you're hunting it, and I'm just guiding you." He tilted his head to the side and studied me. He held my chin with one hand and the back of my head with the other, and then moved my head back and forth. The muscles of my neck were very tense, and moving my head reduced the tension. Don Juan looked up to the sky for a moment and seemed to examine something in it. "It's time to leave," he said dryly and stood up. We walked in an easterly direction until we came upon a patch of small trees in a valley between 2 large hills. It was almost 5 p.m. by then. He casually said that we might have to spend the night in that place. He pointed to the trees and said that there was water around there. He tensed his body and began sniffing the air like an animal. I could see the muscles of his stomach contracting in very fast, short spasms as he blew and inhaled through his nose in rapid succession. He urged me to do the same and find out by myself where the water was. I reluctantly tried to imitate him. After 5 or 6 minutes of fast breathing, I was dizzy, but my nostrils had cleared out in an extraordinary way, and I could actually detect the smell of river willows. I could not tell where they were, however. Don Juan told me to rest for a few minutes, and then he started me sniffing again. The second round was more intense. I could actually distinguish a whiff of river willow coming from my right. We headed in that direction and found, a good quarter of a mile away, a swamp-like spot with stagnant water. We walked around it to a slightly higher flat mesa. Above and around the mesa the chaparral was very thick. "This place is crawling with mountain lions and other smaller cats," Don Juan said casually, as if it were a commonplace observation. I ran to his side and he broke out laughing. "Usually I wouldn't come here at all," he said. "But the crow pointed out this direction. There must be something special about it." "Do we really have to be here, Don Juan?" "We do. Otherwise I would avoid this place." I had become extremely nervous. He told me to listen attentively to what he had to say. "The only thing one can do in this place is hunt lions," he said. "So I'm going to teach you how to do that. There is a special way of constructing a trap for water rats that live around water holes. They serve as bait. The sides of the cage are made to collapse, and very sharp spikes are put along the sides. The spikes are hidden when the trap is up, and they do not affect anything unless something falls on the cage, in which case the sides collapse, and the spikes pierce whatever hits the trap." I could not understand what he meant, but he made a diagram on the ground and showed me that if the side sticks of the cage were placed on pivot-like hollow spots on the frame, the cage would collapse onto either side if something pushed its top. The spikes were pointed sharp slivers of hard wood, which were placed all around the frame and fixed to it. Don Juan said that usually a heavy load of rocks was placed over a net of sticks, which were connected to the cage and hung way above it. When the mountain lion came upon the trap baited with the water rats, it would usually try to break it by pawing it with all its might. Then the slivers would go through its paws, and the cat, in a frenzy, would jump up, unleashing an avalanche of rocks on top of him. "Someday you might need to catch a mountain lion," he said. "They have special powers. They are terribly smart, and the only way to catch them is by fooling them with pain and with the smell of river willows." With astounding speed and skill he assembled a trap, and after a long wait, he caught 3 chubby squirrel-like rodents. He told me to pick a handful of willows from the edge of the swamp and made me rub my clothes with them. He did the same. Then, quickly and skillfully, he wove 2 simple carrying nets out of reeds, scooped up a large clump of green plants and mud from the swamp, and carried it back to the mesa, where he concealed himself. In the meantime the squirrel-like rodents had begun to squeak very loudly. Don Juan spoke to me from his hiding place and told me to use the other carrying net, gather a good chunk of mud and plants, and climb to the lower branches of a tree near the trap where the rodents were. Don Juan said that he did not want to hurt the cat or the rodents, so he was going to hurl the mud at the lion if it came to the trap. He told me to be on the alert and hit the cat with my bundle after he had, in order to scare it away. He recommended I should be extremely careful not to fall out of the tree. His final instructions were to be so still that I would merge with the branches. I could not see where Don Juan was. The squealing of the rodents became extremely loud and finally was so dark that I could hardly distinguish the general features of the terrain. I heard a sudden and close sound of soft steps and a muffled cat-like exhalation, then a very soft growl, and the squirrel-like rodents ceased to squeak. It was right then that I saw the dark mass of an animal right under the tree where I was. Before I could even be sure that it was a mountain lion, it charged against a trap, but before it reached it, something hit it and made it recoil. I hurled my bundle, as Don Juan had told me to do. I missed, yet it made a very loud noise. At that instant, Don Juan let out a series of penetrating yells that sent chills through my spine, and the cat, with extraordinary agility, leaped to the mesa and disappeared. Don Juan kept on making the penetrating noises a while longer, and then he told me to come down from the tree, pick up the cage with the squirrels, run up to the mesa, and get to where he was as fast as I could. In an incredibly short period of time, I was standing next to Don Juan. He told me to imitate his yelling as close as possible in order to keep the lion off while he dismantled the cage and let the rodents free. I began to yell but could not produce the same effect. My voice was raspy because of the excitation. He said I had to abandon myself and yell with real feeling because the lion was still around. Suddenly I fully realized the situation. The lion was real. I let out a magnificent series of piercing yells. Don Juan roared with laughter. He let me yell for a moment, and then he said we had to leave the place as quietly as possible because the lion was no fool and was probably retracing its steps back to where we were. He'll follow us for sure, he said. No matter how careful we are, we'll leave a trail as white as the Pan American Highway. I walked very close to Don Juan. From time to time he would stop for an instant and listen. At one moment he began to run in the dark, and I followed him with my hands extended in front of my eyes to protect myself from the branches. We finally got to the base of the bluff where we had been earlier. Don Juan said that if we succeeded in climbing to the top without being mauled by the lion, we were safe. He went up first to show me the way. We started to climb in the dark. I did not know how, but I followed him with dead sure steps. When we were near the top, I heard a peculiar animal cry. It was almost like the mooing of a cow, except that it was a bit longer and coarser. Up, up, Don Juan yelled. I scrambled to the top in total darkness ahead of Don Juan. When he reached the flat top of the bluff, I was already sitting catching my breath. He rolled on the ground. I thought for a second that the exertion had been too great for him, but he was laughing at my speedy climb. We sat in complete silence for a couple of hours, and then we started back to my car. Sunday, September 3, 1961. Don Juan was not in the house when I woke up. I worked over my notes and had time to get some firewood from the surrounding chaparral before he returned. I was eating when he walked into the house. He began to laugh at what he called my routine of eating at noon, but he helped himself to my sandwiches. I told him that what had happened with the mountain lion was baffling to me. In retrospect, it all seemed unreal. It was as if everything had been staged for my benefit. The succession of events had been so rapid that I really had not had time to be afraid. I had had enough time to act, but not to deliberate upon my circumstances. In writing my notes, the question of whether I had really seen the mountain lion came to mind. The dry branch was still fresh in my memory. It was a mountain lion, Don Juan said imperatively. Was it a real flesh and blood animal? Of course. I told him that my suspicions had been roused because of the easiness of the total event. It was as if the lion had been waiting out there and had been trained to do exactly what Don Juan had planned. He was unruffled by my barrage of skeptical remarks. He laughed at me. "You're a funny fellow," he said. "You saw and heard the cat. It was right under the tree where you were. He didn't smell you and jump at you because of the river willows. They kill any other smell, even for cats. You had a batch of them in your lap." I said that it was not that I doubted him, but that everything that had happened that night was extremely foreign to the events of my everyday life. For a while, as I was writing my notes, I even had the feeling that Don Juan may have been playing the role of the lion. However, I had to discard the idea because I had really seen the dark shape of a four-legged animal charging at the cage and then leaping to the mesa. "Why do you make such a fuss?" he said. "It was just a big cat. There must be thousands of cats in those mountains. Big deal. As usual, you are focusing your attention on the wrong item. It makes no difference whatsoever whether it was a lion or my pants. Your feelings at that moment were what counted. In my entire life I had never seen or heard a big wildcat on the prowl. When I thought of it, I could not get over the fact that I had been only a few feet away from one." Don Juan listened patiently while I went over the entire experience. "Why the offer the big cat?" he asked with an inquisitive expression. "You've been close to most of the animals that live around here, and you've never been so awed by them. Do you like cats?" "No, I don't." "Well, forget about it then." The lesson was not on how to hunt lions, anyway. What was it about? The little crow pointed out that specific spot to me, and at that spot I saw the opportunity of making you understand how one acts while one is in the mood of a warrior. Everything you did last night was done within a proper mood. You were controlled and at the same time abandoned when you jumped down from the tree to pick up the cage and run up to me. You were not paralyzed with fear. And then, near the top of the bluff, when the lion let out a scream, you moved very well. I'm sure you wouldn't believe what you did if you looked at the bluff during the daytime. You had a degree of abandon, and at the same time you had a degree of control over yourself. You did not let go and wet your pants, and yet you let go and climbed that wall in complete darkness. You could have missed the trail and killed yourself. To climb that wall in darkness required that you had to hold on to yourself and let go of yourself at the same time. That's what I call the mood of a warrior. I said that whatever I had done that night was the product of my fear and not the result of any mood of control and abandon. I know that, he said, smiling. And I wanted to show you that you can spur yourself beyond your limits if you are in the proper mood. A warrior makes his own mood. You didn't know that. Fear got you into the mood of a warrior, but now that you know about it, anything can serve to get you into it. I wanted to argue with him, but my reasons were not clear. I felt an inexplicable sense of annoyance. It's convenient to always act in such a mood, he continued. It cuts through the crap and leaves one purified. It was a great feeling when you reached the top of the bluff. Wasn't it? I told him that I understood what he meant, yet I felt it would be idiotic to try to apply what he was teaching me to my everyday life. One needs the mood of a warrior for every single act, he said. Otherwise one becomes distorted and ugly. There is no power in a life that lacks this mood. Look at yourself. Everything offends and upsets you. You whine and complain and feel that everyone is making you dance to their tune. You are a leaf at the mercy of the wind. There is no power in your life. What an ugly feeling that must be. A warrior, on the other hand, is a hunter. He calculates everything. That's control. But once his calculations are over, he acts. He lets go. That's abandon. A warrior is not a leaf at the mercy of the wind. No one can push him. No one can make him do things against himself or against his better judgment. A warrior is tuned to survive, and he survives in the best of all possible fashions. I liked his stance, although I thought it was unrealistic. It seemed too simplistic for the complex world in which I lived. He laughed at my arguments, and I insisted that the mood of a warrior could not possibly help me overcome the feeling of being offended or actually being injured by the actions of my fellow men, as in the hypothetical case of being physically harassed by a cruel and malicious person placed in a position of authority. He roared with laughter and admitted the example was apropos. A warrior could be injured but not offended, he said. For a warrior, there is nothing offensive about the acts of his fellow men, as long as he himself is acting within the proper mood. The other night you were not offended by the lion. The fact that it chased us did not anger you. I did not hear you cursing it, nor did I hear you say that he had no right to follow us. It could have been a cruel and malicious lion for all you know. But that was not a consideration while you struggled to avoid it. The only thing that was pertinent was to survive. And that you did very well. If you would have been alone and the lion had caught up with you and mauled you to death, you would have never even considered complaining or feeling offended by its acts. The mood of a warrior is not so far-fetched for yours or anybody's world. You need it in order to cut through all the guff. I explained my way of reasoning. The lion and my fellow men were not on a par, because I knew the intimate quirks of men, while I knew nothing about the lion. What offended me about my fellow men was that they acted maliciously and knowingly. I know, Don Juan said patiently. To achieve the mood of a warrior is not a simple matter. It is a revolution. To regard the lion and the water rats and our fellow men as equals is a magnificent act of the warrior's spirit. It takes power to do that. And that's not all. Our experts and regular viewers respond to all comments. Also check if you forgot to subscribe and set your bell to receive notifications about new audiobooks and other useful self-development materials that we release regularly. Join in the discussions, don't forget to give likes and, if possible and inspired, support the development of the channel financially. All useful links will be in the description and the first attached comment. Goodness, love and wisdom to all. And now move on to watch the next part of the video at the links below, or choose something from the playlists of the channel and those you see on the screen.